In this series on the seven churches of Revelation, we've moved now to Philadelphia. Now, I have a special love in my heart for Philadelphia. I lived in the Philly area for 15 years and had a wonderful experience there. Still miss Philadelphia. But now we're talking about a different Philadelphia. Philadelphia, that was a city in Asia Minor. Actually, there was one in Egypt too. It means brotherly love. And so it's a nice thing to name a city, although cities often do not live up to such names. In any case, this was a Philadelphia in Asia Minor, and the next message to the seven churches. So after Thyatira and Sardis, you come to Philadelphia, which is the one right before Laodicea. So nearly done with the messages to the seven churches. Here you get a closer up picture of what the area around it looked like. Coming from Sardis, Philadelphia is the next one, and then it would go on to Laodicea. Here is what modern Philadelphia, not again Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, where I used to live, but the Philadelphia in Asia Minor um, is this is the community there, viewed from the ancient Acropolis. Here's the ancient theater stage at Philadelphia. And here is a personification of Philadelphia at the statue base of Tiberius from the first century. You can see it more clearly in this picture, Philadelphia written across the bottom. And here's a bronze coin of Domitian, the emperor, minted in Philadelphia. So about the time John's messenger would have been bringing the message to the city, Domitian was reigning. Here's Caligula. He was emperor like half a century earlier. Now, of the seven churches, only Philadelphia and Smyrna are praised without correction. Laodicea was strong in its own sight, and yet it was weak. Philadelphia had little strength, but it's going to be praised. Smyrna was poor and yet rich. Laodicea was rich and yet poor. So God doesn't see the way people see, just as God told Samuel when he wanted to pick David's older brother, and no, it was supposed to be David. The only unconditionally praised churches out of the seven were the two that were being persecuted. Now, were they being persecuted because they were godly, or were they godly because they were being persecuted? It could be some of each. But when you're being persecuted, you know what it's going to cost you, and you're serious for God, or you just don't pretend. So these are two serious churches in Smyrna and Philadelphia. They're ready to die for their faith if need be. But ultimately, the death is going to come more for the one church than for the other, more for Smyrna than for Philadelphia. He gives a promise of deliverance for Philadelphia. He says, the one who holds the key of David, what he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. Well, earlier, Jesus holds the keys of death and Hades. Here, he holds the key of David, like the palace keys, so to speak, for the kingdom. You can see that keys and locks looked a little bit different back then, uh, different than the ones I have now. So, yep. Here, bronze keys for doors, wardrobes, crates, or chests from the Roman period. Here is a monk closing a door with this big kind of key and lock. And we have some similar gates in the world today. So in a lot of Africa, in the bigger homes, there's some gates to protect on the outside. I took this picture not for the gate, but because my son, when he was younger, was at the gate. But still useful gate picture. David and I were playing frisbee that day in Cameroon. So, an official called a major domo controls access to the palace. That was a position of very high authority. You saw how big those keys were. As the king or as some other official, you don't want to be carrying those around. That's one official who's in charge of those keys. And in the book of Isaiah, you had somebody who was in that position, and Isaiah prophesied, he's out. God's going to raise up somebody else to be in that position. Well, this position of high authority, placed on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut. What he shuts, no one can open. So, open door before you, good news. He determines, in other words, who may enter to see the king and who may not. And this is significant for those who feel excluded from God's people. They're told, no, you have an open door to me. The churches in Smyrna and Philadelphia may be experiencing some of what the main audience of the Gospel of John was experiencing, and where they needed to be encouraged. And John has a good account about Jesus' ministry that should encourage them. So in John chapter 9, there's a guy who had been blind. Jesus heals him, but then some of the religious leaders pick on him and say, you're going to follow Jesus? You didn't belong to us. And they put him out of the synagogue. Well, some of John's audience could identify with that, because in some cities like Smyrna and Philadelphia, we see that Jewish believers in Jesus were being put out of their synagogues. Now, most synagogues I've gone to today are really nice. I don't see them putting people out of the synagogues. I mean, if you're an axe murderer or something, I think they probably would. I think we probably all want you not in circulation among us, at least not with an axe in your hand. But anyway, but in the first century, there were some tensions, and in some of the synagogues, and apparently those in Smyrna and Philadelphia, so far as we can gather from the book of Revelation, you had Jewish believers in Jesus being cast out. So going back to the Gospel of John, John talks about a similar situation. So this guy who was healed gets cast out of the synagogue. He's treated like he's no longer a member of God's people. But Jesus goes on to talk about him in John 10, no break between chapter 9 and chapter 10 in the original. John goes on to talk about him as one of his sheep. And who then is Jesus? Well, Jesus is talking about the good shepherd who lays down his life to protect the sheep. Jesus is the good shepherd. And who are the religious people who are putting the guy out of the synagogue? In John 10, they're called thieves and robbers and wolves. People who are taking the authority over the sheep for themselves, for their own benefit, instead of letting the shepherd do what he needs to do. And in light of Old Testament background, the guy being one of Jesus' sheep means he does belong to God's people. Because God's people, how are they portrayed in the Old Testament? Often, Israel, they were portrayed as sheep. And who was the chief shepherd of God's people? We read about David, we read about Moses, but especially we read about God, Adonai. And Jesus fills that role naturally in the Gospel of John, as in the book of Revelation. And, well, these leaders who are trying to keep the power to themselves and put out people who follow Jesus, they stand in the place of the false shepherds of Israel in Ezekiel 34, where God has to intervene and say, I'm going to take care of the sheep because my shepherds aren't doing it. So he says, I know you have little strength, but you've kept my word. You haven't denied my name. In the Bible, God often favors those who have little power. You think of David and Goliath, for example, but you also think of Israel when they were slaves in Egypt. And God says to them, I redeemed you. I brought you out. I didn't set my affection on you and choose you because you were mightier than other peoples. You were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you, kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors. That's why he redeemed you. It's not by our strength, it's by his strength. And so you have little strength. It's okay. You're special. You're precious to God. And then he says, I'll make those who are the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, but they're not, but are liars, make them come, fall down at your feet, and acknowledge that I have loved you. And some of the background for that we covered when we talked about the believers in Smyrna who were kicked out of the synagogue there. So some people were saying, hey, we are the ones who have the right to decide whether you belong to us or not. And Jesus is saying, I'm the one who has the right to decide whether you belong to me or not. And you do belong to me. And the ones who put them out, it's like, you can call yourselves whatever you want, but you're not being faithful to my covenant. So that was Jesus's approach to them. And today we might think analogously of, churches that put people out if people are too in love with Jesus. And who's really going to walk with Jesus in robes of white? Who's really going to be coming and bowing at the feet of those who really do love Jesus? Here just some pictures from ancient Israel, or the period of ancient Israel, of people bowing down. So you get a sense of it. It's kind of a humiliating posture. Anyway, so there was an expectation from Isaiah chapter 60, verse 14, that Gentiles would bow down to Israel in the end time. The children of your oppressors will come bowing before you. All who despise you will bow down at your feet and will call you the city of the Lord, Zion of the Holy One of Israel. Think New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. But here, unbelieving Jewish people are in league with Gentiles and bowing down to the persecuted remnant, the Jewish people who really are following their Messiah. So acknowledge that I loved you. They'll come and acknowledge that I loved you. If you're rejected in the name of God, you're precious to God and you walk close to God's heart. Some of the people I know who walk closest to Jesus are the people whose hearts have been most broken by others. But the Lord is near the brokenhearted. He's near the lowly, far from the proud. And of course, in John's situation, this was the synagogue in Philadelphia, the issue there. But the principle extends far beyond that, to where those who are marginalized by others can find special favor with God. He's not impressed with what the world is impressed by. Our Father loves us. Well, then it contrasts heaven dwellers and earth dwellers. Earth dwellers in the book of Revelation are the wicked who invite judgment. And you see a number of references to earth dwellers in the book of Revelation. But heaven dwellers, those who dwell in heaven, most of us dwell on earth right now, but we will be in heaven, and God is with the heaven dwellers. Now, at this point, I'm digressing from actually explaining a text to maybe mis-explaining, or rather explaining what it doesn't mean, the way some people have used it to mean. So some people have applied 3:10 to the Great Tribulation. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I'll also keep you from the hour of trial, or the hour of testing that's going to come on the whole world to test those who live on the earth. Is that talking about the Great Tribulation? Is it talking about the final judgment, where people will certainly be tested? Well, the immediate context of this is endurance and suffering. it's specifically addressing the church in Philadelphia. So that means if you live in Philadelphia suburbs, Wynwood, which is where I used to live, or a bunch of other places, Upper Darby, all those places in around Philadelphia, only the church in Philadelphia gets raptured. The rest of you have to stay put. No, that's not what it means. But the church in ancient Philadelphia was going to be protected from something. So, what does keep from mean? Technically, it could mean take out of, so you keep them from going through something, but it also could mean keep from, like protect from while you're there. How do we know that? Well, tereo ek, the wording that's used here, is used just one other place in the New Testament. And it's also Jesus speaking, and it's also John recording it. And that's in John 17:15, where it says, where Jesus says, I pray not that uh, I pray not that you would be taken out, but rather that you would be protected from. And so he uses take out of in that way. So the whole book context also in Revelation, you've got righteous people being protected through tribulation, not being protected from persecution, but being protected from God's judgments. When is Jesus for coming first described in Revelation? When is the resurrection first recounted in the book of Revelation? What is that resurrection called in Revelation 20? Are there still saints on earth in the meantime? Is there any mention of taking out of saints in the book of Revelation? So it's really reading a lot into the book of Revelation to read Revelation 3:10 as taking the church out before a period of tribulation. Now, I'm not challenging your view on the doctrine. I'm just saying this is not a good argument for that. The words keep from, John 17:15, my prayer is not that you would take them out of the world, but that you would keep them from, protect them from the evil one. Tereo ek. To overcome, you have to persevere. Now, each of the 7 churches is called to overcome, but many of them have different tests. Well, the last church we looked at, Sardis, some of them were not going to have their names blotted out of the book of life, implying that the rest of them would. And they needed to hold on. They needed to persevere, the ones who were going to have their names written in the book of life. Well, here also, to overcome, you have to persevere. I'm coming soon, Jesus says. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take your crown. Crown was a victor's wreath, not like the crowns you sometimes think of, big gold with spikes and so on. This was normally a wreath, Stephanos, that would be given to somebody who won in an athletic competition or sometimes in a military fight. The implication is, if you don't hold on, if you don't persevere until I come, you're not going to be in the kingdom. You won't overcome. You won't be victorious. It's those who are victorious who inherit all the things that Revelation goes on to talk about as good things in the future. So hang in there. And that is not some people say that's a certain kind of theology. Actually, it's pretty widespread theology. Calvinists say that you can, if you fall away from the faith, you weren't saved to begin with. Arminians say if you fall away from the faith, maybe you were saved and you lost it. But Calvinists and Arminians both agree that if you fall away from the faith, you're lost. So I'm not talking about somebody who you lose your temper, or it's not like you're in and out of salvation or in and out of perseverance on a regular basis. It's like somebody who turns away from following Christ, doesn't continue to trust in Christ as their Savior and let Him work in your heart. So here's the promise for those who persevere. I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. I don't exactly have a pillar here, right? No, I have a pillar beam up at the top, sort of, but I can't illustrate with a pillar, although if the roof fell in, maybe these file cabinets would double as that. But how many of you would like to be stuck in one place for the rest of eternity as a pillar holding up a roof? Fortunately, it's not meant literally. Back then, pillar was an image of strength, just like you can speak of somebody who's a pillar of your community. It could mean that back then, both in Greek usage, also in Jewish usage. You have in one of the Psalms, may your daughters be like pillars in the house of God. So, but here we will not only be in the future temple, but we will be part of it. But again, it's not meant literally. It just means we're designated as part of the future temple of God, the dwelling place of God, the New Jerusalem, which is shaped like a cube, like the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament. So some of this language, you see it in Isaiah 56:5, where it's actually promised to Gentiles and to eunuchs, both of whom were officially excluded from Israel, apart from certain conditions. And for eunuchs, it was kind of hard to undo those conditions. So, but in Isaiah 56, the promise is given to them, I'll give them within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. Give them an everlasting name that won't be cut off. Get a new name, and they'll be within the temple. And even in Solomon's temple, Gentiles were permitted there. It didn't get segregated in terms of the outer court until the time of Solomon. Till the time of Herod's temple. Solomon's temple, you had the most holy place, priestly sanctuary, then the outer court was for everybody else. But in Herod's temple, with greater precautions about understanding of priestly purity, you had the holiest place, the priestly court. Outside that, the court of Israel for Jewish men. Outside that, the court of women for Jewish women. And then outside that, court of the Gentiles. So in other words, Gentiles weren't allowed beyond the outer part of the court. But in 1 Kings 8, Solomon prayed the Gentiles would feel free to come and pray toward God's house, and God would hear their prayers. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have an image of an eschatological future temple where no Gentiles are welcome. And I understand where they get their exegesis by translating something in Zechariah 14 in terms of not a traitor, but a Canaanite. But anyway, happily in the New Testament, Gentiles who serve the God of Israel are welcome as part of his future house. So, and temples had pillars. Well, certainly Solomon's temple had pillars, and this is a reconstruction of Herod's temple, had plenty of pillars, as you can see. And here's the facade of the Jerusalem temple depicted on a coin, a later coin, and you see some pillars. And according to Ezekiel, the end time temple will also have that. This was not my wife and me at the end time temple, but we were at sort of the site. I mean, you can see the site where the temple used to be, and we're standing with that in the background. And my wife is so lovely, but I need to move on to the next slide as much as I like to keep staring at my wife. Obviously, there were lots of temples in the ancient world that had pillars constructed somewhat differently, but here are pillars from the Parthenon in Athens, some anthropoid pillars that look like people in Athens. Temple of Bacchus at Baalbek, Syria. This is, I think, bigger and more intact. And pillar in St. John's Church in Philadelphia. And here, actually, this one, I think I took the first one as a picture of a pillar in the synagogue in Capernaum. But over here, you see some pillars, and this is by the southern steps of the temple in Jerusalem. Yeah, and pillars often included honorary inscriptions, writing on them. So, we're going to be pillars in the temple of God, and we're going to have something written on us. Don't worry about it. It's probably symbolic. It'll be good, though. I mean, well, if you're going to get a tattoo, let God give you a good tattoo. So he's going to write his name on us and the name of the New Jerusalem. Here's the name of Jerusalem inscribed on a column. Thank you, Todd Boland, for these pictures. And after this, we will go to Laodicea, the church that thought it was all that. Quite in contrast to the church in Philadelphia, that's humble, that's dependent on God, that recognizes it's weak and it needs God's strength. And they're going to be vindicated. Jesus has some harder words for the church in Laodicea for next time.